Thanks to you all for being here. I'm excited to be here and talk to you and with you about something I love, which is savannas. So just to get a grasp of the audience, by a show of hands, how many of you have ever visited or toured or been in a place that you would classify as a savanna? All right. What are some places that you have been to?
Northern Indiana.
Okay, Northern Indiana. Yeah.
Minnesota.
All right.
North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Oak savannas.
Yeah, absolutely, oak savannas. So, yeah, there are savannas here in the U.S. We don't typically, when we think of the word savanna, necessarily think of the U.S. right away. A lot of times when we think of savannas, we think of something like this, right? So this is Pride Rock from The Lion King. And throughout that movie, it depicts savannas as these really open and grassy plains that have a few of these large trees sprinkled across the landscape. And as a kid, I loved The Lion King. It got me really excited about nature, and it also kind of set up this dream that maybe one day I would be able to go and visit these iconic ecosystems and see all of that charismatic wildlife that they support. And so in 2017, I was a grad student in Kansas studying plant ecology, and I had the opportunity to go over to Southern Africa for a class, a group research project, and I was really surprised when the very first savanna I ever saw looked like this. So it's not completely different from that Lion King-esque savannas. It still has these really big open skies. You can see across to the horizon, but it is certainly not this just wide open grassy plain with just a few trees here and there. It's really quite woody. There are all of these really low-lying shrubs that are really dominant on the landscape. And as we traveled around Botswana in South Africa, every savanna we went to looked a little bit different. Some of them had those big, tall trees. Others were essentially just open, grassy plains. And some of them were really dry, having those like cactus-like euphorbs all across the landscape. And this is all within just about 300 miles of each other. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in what savannas look like in a really narrow area. And as it turns out, this question about what determines tree covers in savannas, why these look so different, is a really foundational question in savanna ecology. It's one that we've been trying to answer for decades, and it's one that savanna ecologists are still debating. And this is the question that I'm going to explore with you all today. I have 3 little sections here to walk us through this. The first being, what are savannas and why are they important? The second is what shapes plant cover in savannas, and then how do we protect savannas from climate and land use change? So all of those pictures that I have already showed you look quite different from one another, but they're all classified as savannas because there are these systems that are co-dominated by trees and grasses. And so trees and grasses, 2 very different growth forms that have very different growth requirements. They have very different animals that eat them, but they both thrive in this ecosystem together. One doesn't necessarily outcompete the other. And this is really unique. There are not very many ecosystems on Earth that have this dual codominance of 2 very different growth forms. Grasslands are wide open plains that have very little to no tree cover, and forests are really, really dense canopies that have very shady understories. And so we have to recognize and appreciate this duality and this coexistence between trees and grasses if we're going to be able to properly identify savannas and then be able to properly manage them and successfully manage them as our ecosystems are changing. So although they are unique in what they look like compared to other biomes, they are not rare. Savannas are located all over the world. Particularly in Africa, savannas take up over half of the continent, but they're also really widespread in South America, especially in Brazil with the Cerrado, and in northeastern Australia. And we even have some savannas here in the US, as a lot of you pointed out. The oak savannas in the Midwest and northern Indiana, and then the long leaf pine savannas in the southeast United States. And all of these savannas across the globe look quite different from each other. They have a different amount of tree cover, they support different plant and animal species. And because they are so widespread, a lot of humans depend on savannas for their livelihoods. So about 20% of the human population, that is about 1/5 or 1.6 billion people, directly depend on savannas for their everyday lives. Most savannas are used as rangelands for grazing livestock, goats, sheep, but the woody component in savannas is really important for the timber industry, as well as a lot of people who live in Africa use fuel wood as their main energy source. They have cultural and medicinal values for the cultures that live in savannas, and they also attract a huge amount of people. People pay a lot of money to go travel to these places and go see all of the wildlife that are really beautiful and wonderful to see, and that creates jobs and a lot of income into these economies. In addition, savannas are extremely biodiverse. Of course, they're famous for these really big, charismatic wildlife that we all think of, Cape buffalo and elephant and zebras. They also have a huge diversity of plants. And African savannas are the last continent on Earth that support intact communities of these large herbivores. So they provide a really great study system that we can test ecological theory and try and tease apart how big animals impacted our ecosystems, both now in Africa and the past for the mammals that used to be spread all over the world. And then finally, the stability of savannas is dependent on how humans alter this coexistence between trees and grasses. So throughout the talk today, we're really thinking about what affects that balance between these two very different growth forms, and what are the consequences if that balance shifts. Okay, so that moves us into part 2 about what shapes plant cover in savannas. And back to our foundational question for the day, what determines tree cover? Why is it that some savannas look like the one on the left, while some savannas look like the one on the right? And this is a really hard and complex question to answer, although it seems rather simple. And that's because it's not just one driver that determines how many trees grow in a savanna. It's some really complex interactions between several drivers. So seasonal rainfall, as well as fire and herbivory, herbivores being all the animals that eat the plants. So from a climate perspective, savannas have these really dynamic seasonal rainfall patterns where in the wet season, so this is a map from NASA, and you can see in southern Africa how green it is during the wet season and then how brown that area becomes during the dry season. And the seasonal rainfall is really a defining feature of savannas and really underlies how fire and herbivores shape the vegetation. So a lot of times we even refer to savannas as disturbance-prone ecosystems because of how integral things like fire and herbivory are to shaping the vegetation. And so for the rest of this part of the talk, I'm going to dive a little bit more into fire and herbivores and how they shape tree cover. Okay, so herbivores and fire are both consumers of plants. And ultimately, they help keep savannas grassy and open and keep tree cover low. So the smaller the tree, the more vulnerable it is to being consumed by being eaten or going up in flames when savannas burn. And as they become larger, they become less vulnerable and less susceptible to dying due to either of these disturbances. So savannas burn a lot, more than any other ecosystem in the world. And Africa in particular accounts for about 70% of the world's annually burned area. And you can see just how drastic this is in this map, where all of those red areas are areas that burn pretty much every year. Africa is a big hotspot here, but we also see the hotspots in the other areas of the savanna, like the Cerrado in South America and also in northeastern Australia. So even though savannas burn extremely frequently, they don't burn extremely hot. They're not super intense fires. These are typically low-lying grass fires that kind of slowly spread across the soil surface. And the grasses love fire. Fire is something that helped grasslands become so dominant across the globe. After the fire sweeps through, they're able to quickly resprout, and then they form this nice green, nutritious grass layer that's really attractive to the grazing animals and livestock. To give you an idea of what happens when fire stops burning on the tree layer, these are photos from experimental burn plots in Kruger National Park in South Africa. These are experimental plots that have been running for over half a century. Some have been burned every year since they started, some every 3 years, and some haven't been burned for the last 50 years. And you can see just how drastic that increase in tree cover is when you stop burning. So ultimately, on a continental scale, it's rainfall that controls fire. You have to have two requirements in order to get fires that burn frequently. You have to have enough rain for the grass to grow to create your fuel, and then you have to have long enough dry seasons for the grass to dry down to cure that fuel. And this has really major impacts on continental patterns of fire in Africa. So we have some areas that are too dry. They don't burn very often because they don't have enough fuel. And some areas that are too wet, like the rainforest in the Congo, they don't have long enough dry seasons for those fuels to cure. And this ultimately has really, really big impacts on the tree layer. So this is a map of the southern region of Africa, where you can see the drier regions in the southwestern corner have much lower tree cover than the wetter regions in the upper eastern side that have more tree cover, indicated by those green and red colors. If you were to flip a switch and just turn fire off completely across the African continent, especially in this area, you get massive increases in tree cover. So this is going from 0 to 40% tree cover all the way up to 60 to 90% tree cover just due to fire alone. That's like a 2 to 9 times increase, and that has massive consequences on nutrient water cycles in these systems, habitat for the wildlife, and how people are able to utilize the landscape. Okay, so I want to shift now to thinking about the effects of animals on the vegetation. You can think of fire as being a non-selective consumer. It doesn't care what plants are there as long as they will burn. Herbivores, on the other hand, are very picky. And they have the biggest impact on these low-lying shrubs that are easy to reach, and they prevent them to growing up into these taller trees. So we classify herbivores into 3 main categories. Browsers eat the woody plants, so that would be like the kudu. That's a kudu. A kudu, a giraffe, and a steenbok here. And they affect tree cover because if you have more browsers on the landscape, they eat more trees, you have less trees. We have grazers like the zebra, the waterbuck, the Cape buffalo, and the wildebeest. And these actually, even though they don't eat trees, they can have massive effects on tree cover because they eat all the grass. And if you have less grass, it's easier for trees to establish. So when you have more more grazers on the landscape, you can actually get these increases in tree cover. And then we have the mixed feeders. So these would be the impala, which are like the cheeseburgers of the savanna. They are all over the place, and a lot of predators target them. You have the elephants, and then other herbivores like the inyala. And mixed feeders eat both grasses and woody plants, and they tend to switch their diet seasonally. So this goes back to the importance of how rainfall seasonality affects herbivore behavior. They will eat grasses during the wet season when they're nutritious and abundant, and then as those dry down and senesce, they switch their forage to the woody plants. To give you a visual of just how massive of an impact herbivores have on the plant community, this is an herbivore exposure study from Kenya. This is one that I'm doing some of my postdoctoral work in. And you have on the left side an area where herbivores have access to, and on the right side an area where herbivores have been kept out with an electric fence for the last 17 years. And it's huge. I mean, there's so much more grass. The trees are much taller. They have these really incredible impacts. Okay, so I told you a few slides ago that herbivore impacts are biggest on the small trees, and then once trees grow out to be a larger size class, they're no longer really susceptible. They've kind of made it. They're the lucky ones. But there is a pretty big exception to this rule. Does anyone have a guess on what happened to this tree? Sorry? Lightning. It could have been lightning. It's elephants. Elephants are super destructive to trees. And they seem to do it just for fun. They're really smart. They're really curious, and they like to wreak havoc. This is actually a really big issue for if you're trying to set up scientific equipment out in the field. The elephants always find it. Here's another one. This is a tree that I had marked to sample this summer. I came out to the field to measure it, and it had been completely toppled over. And one more example where an elephant came in here, ripped out all the branches, and just made a big mess of things. And these individual impacts on trees actually scale up to have massive effects on the tree layer. So once again, these are those herbivore exclosures. On the left there, you have an area where all herbivores are able to access, and on the right there has only kept out elephants and giraffes. And it's a huge impact. The trees get much taller. There's more of them, and you end up having a much woodier savanna. When you keep out all the herbivores is when you start to get effects on that understory grassy layer. So the way that they kept out the elephants is they put these big, tall electric fences up that allow all other animals to pass through except for the elephants. And then this one on the right here, they've kept out all animals. Okay, so we've kind of gone through these drivers of what drives tree cover in savannas, being rainfall, fire, and herbivory. And we've known for a long time that these make a difference or are important for affecting tree cover. But it's really complex, and we're really just at the tip of the iceberg in understanding how all of these interact together and what's going to happen to our savannas once all of these drivers shift. And that's what we're seeing happen. We're seeing shifts in rainfall patterns. We're seeing fire being suppressed due to landscape fragmentation. And we're seeing large herbivore declines due to habitat loss, hunting, and replacing by domesticated cattle. And when all of these things happen together, you take an ecosystem that looks like this, and you turn it into something that looks like this. And now that balance between trees and grasses that are a defining feature of savannas has been thrown out of whack. And this has massive consequences on the animals that live there and the people who depend on them. We see decreases in plant biodiversity, decreases in forage for livestock, which has a huge economic consequences for the people who depend their livelihoods on managing those livestock. And we even see fundamental shifts into carbon, water, and nutrient cycling. It's a lot harder to see wildlife when you have a bunch of trees in your way, and that can have economic consequences on decreasing ecotourism. So this has a big effect on livelihoods. It's something a lot of people are interested in, and this has been the center of my PhD work and then some of my postdoc work here at Notre Dame. Okay, so how do we protect savannas? Right now, the hot topic is nature-based climate solutions. And these are efforts to conserve and restore and manage natural systems to increase carbon storage and minimize our greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of really good examples of successful measures of this. So like wetland restoration to reduce flooding and reef restoration to reduce erosion on the coast. But when it comes to savannas, we're kind of obsessed with this idea of planting trees. So these are all logos of tree planting initiatives, which are really flashy campaigns. A lot of times their goal is just to plant as many trees as possible, so you can say that you've planted 50,000 trees in an hour. And they gain a lot of community support because it's really fun to get together, get excited about nature, and then go plant a tree with your friends. But we have to take a step back and think about the efficacy of these practices. This is a map. All those light green areas are areas that have been identified for tree planting campaigns, and they're exactly where all of our savannas and grasslands exist around the world, which didn't typically have these large treed areas to begin with. There's a lot of problems with this. The first is that most of the time when these tree planting campaigns happen, they're planting pine or eucalyptus plantations, which are not native species to wherever they go. And you can see that this looks a lot less biodiverse than all of those other systems that I had just shown you. In addition, this is a really short solution for carbon sequestration because these trees get harvested and then all of that carbon just goes back into the atmosphere. There are many countries that have pledged for tree planting campaigns that look like this. So this is Namibia. It's a desert. It never had forested area, and it probably doesn't have enough water to support these campaigns, even if they were to happen. And then finally, this goal of planting trees in order to sequester carbon kind of just masks the real issue, which is our carbon emissions. And there's really no large-scale solution to decreasing these that doesn't involve decreasing the emissions themselves. And so when these campaigns are not done well or with a lot of planning, they're really just an issue and another threat for these savannas, all the animals that we get excited and care about, and all the people who depend on them. So to wrap up with what we can do, to end on a positive note, is you guys have already done it. You came to a talk today and listened to talk about science, and that's great. As a community, we have to support and advocate for evidence-based research, and that starts with a conversation about what our natural systems are, why they matter, what threatens them, and what we can do to protect and restore them, with the hope that that will lead to supporting conservation and restoration efforts that are actually aimed at restoring biodiversity in ecosystem function, not just for all of these savannas, but for the forests and all of the biomes around Earth. Okay, and with that, I will end with this quote by a very influential savanna ecologist for let's plant the right tree in the right place for the right reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Does anyone have any questions?
So your point about So your point about the tree campaigns.
Yeah.
So do you happen to know how much, can you make it something dramatic to say, well, gosh, you can plant 100,000 trees, but that's only supplants 10,000 cars or something like that?
Yeah, there's a lot. Well, I mean, that's really how a lot of these campaigns advertise themselves, is like, we planted this many trees and that's equal to taking this many cars off the road. But those numbers are really hard to like trust and put a good number on, because a lot of these tree planting campaigns don't have follow-up plans. So they'll go out and plant 50,000 trees in a day. Maybe 10% of those survive. And so I'm not trying to say that tree planting is bad. I'm trying to say that we have to do it in a way that keeps in mind the ecosystem that we're trying to restore.
Very cool talk. I thought all the long-term experiments you showed were really cool. I was just curious about the Kruger experiment. It obviously looked like, you could see these big differences between where they have suppressed fire and they haven't. But I was wondering, the treatment where they suppressed fire for, I think you said like 50 years or something, have there ever been like accidental fires? Like, it seems very difficult to suppress fires for that long.
I don't know exactly. I would be surprised if there wasn't maybe a burn. The way that they burn in Kruger is they throw a match where they think an area needs to burn and then let it go. But the reason that they can do that is because you don't get crazy intense wildfires in savannas. It's these low intensity grass fires. The vegetation is patchy enough that it can extinguish itself. So if it hits a wall of trees, that fire is going to extinguish itself.
Very cool talk. Sure. I was wondering, like, as tree cover increases in some of these places and they get a lot more woody, are you starting to see more, like, larger fires or more catastrophic fires that cause problems?
Yes. So, especially if you think about, so in the Western US, one of our biggest problems is with a cedar encroachment, which is kind of the same idea of the things I'm talking about here. Fire has been suppressed for a long time. These trees have moved in, and they're really highly flammable. And so we actually move towards a system that has these low intensity fires frequently to these systems that are covered in trees. They don't burn very often, but when they do, they burn hot. And they're able to jump across highways, catch on fires, and that's how we get these really out of control wildfires that are happening out west.
Anyone else? No? Well, thank you all. Oh, one more question.
So regarding, I'm not standing up. So that regarding the elephants and how destructive they are to the ecosystem, do we need to move or have a division of how many elephants are in a certain area or have some elephant control?
You just hit on like a very highly debated topic in national parks across Africa, because elephants are obviously a super important, charismatic animal that we love. They're threatened by poaching and habitat fragmentation, but the only place for them to really exist peacefully with humans now are in national parks, and those national parks aren't really big enough to support elephants. So there's a lot of conversation. There's like hot takes on both sides of the coin, where some people think this is a really important animal, we protect them no matter what, and other people think maybe we need to start thinking about culling or relocating or finding ways to manage elephants so they're not so destructive to the vegetation. Good question.
Any other questions? No. Well, thank you very much, Emily, and thank you all for coming.